6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Following the end of World War II, billions of people around the world were placed at the mercy of the nuclear bomb. The utter obliteration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated the staggering power of nuclear weaponry, and the massive buildup of nuclear weapons and hostile tensions that ensued between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War exacerbated the nuclear threat. However, several far-sighted leaders recognized the potential for conflict and compromised their nation's ideological differences in order to prevent global catastrophe. With the inauguration of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, a series of negotiations between the leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States, significant strides towards disarmament and harmony were made, restoring a semblance of stability to the chaotic world. The end of World War II was met with celebration from all members of the victorious Allies. However, benevolent relations between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly deteriorated into one of the most enduring and straining conflicts in history, the Cold War. Since the beginning of World War II, the Soviet Union's relationship with the other Allies had been precarious, as the capitalist doctrines of Great Britain, the United States, and France fundamentally conflicted with that of the Communist Soviet Union. Once Germany surrendered, their political incompatibilities intensified. Desperate for a communist buffer zone between itself and capitalist Western Europe, the Soviet Union installed satellite governments in Eastern Europe. Agitated, the United States endorsed the policy of containment, dedicating itself to halting further expansion of communism, exemplified by a speech delivered by President Truman.
We must take immediate and resolute action.
The Soviet Union subsequently denounced the United States and their support for free enterprise, driving the wedge between the two countries even deeper. Thus, the antagonism between the two adversaries was irreconcilable by the 1950s, setting the stage for 5 decades of hostility and the most threatening arms buildup in history. From August 6, 1945 to August 9, over 150,000 innocent people died in the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with countless more suffering slow, agonizing deaths from radiation poisoning. Such was the grand debut of the atomic bomb, the deadliest weapon to blight the earth yet. However, in unleashing what President Truman remarked as a harnessing of the basic power of the universe, the United States issued a figurative challenge to the Soviet Union, stimulating the nuclear arms race and aggravating the potential for large-scale anguish. Desperate to reach parity with their rival, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in Kazakhstan on August 29, 1949. In response, the United States countered with the testing of the hydrogen bomb in 1952, a weapon 1,200 times as powerful as the one dropped on Hiroshima. In 1953, the Soviet Union matched the United States, locking each country into a perpetual cycle of design and redesign. According to Terry Jenkins, former president of Aerojet Tech Systems and lead engineer on the Titan I and II ICBM projects,
when we were on the end of producing some of the propulsion for some of those offensive weapons, and every time we made an advancement and had a better missile, then from that point in time, most of the threat was in the Russian side of the equation. And they would then up their defense capability, or they would increase their offense capability. And so,
thus, by the 1950s, the Soviet Union and the United States were engaged in an insatiable arms race, fueled by their ever-increasing animosity and the unmitigated advancement of nuclear technology. The superpowers also pioneered new systems of weapon delivery, and intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs, and multiple independently targetable vehicles, or MIRVs, were developed during the late 1950s, enabling nuclear payloads to be delivered distances of over 5,000 miles.
an incoming warhead at 17,000 miles an hour is very, very difficult to intercept.
By the dawn of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks in 1967, the United States and the Soviet Union collectively harbored almost 40,000 nuclear warheads, each with the potential to kill millions. In fact, the destruction wrought by a single nuclear attack was predicted to be so catastrophic that citizens of both the United States and the Soviet Union were instructed to build fallout shelters and practice safety drills to prepare for nuclear bombings, reflecting the tangible reality of nuclear war. As each combatant relentlessly tried to one-up the other, it became apparent to the leaders of each nation that in order to promote peace and protect the population, provisions must be made. A form of compromise during this tumultuous period presented itself in the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, commonly known as SALT, beginning in 1967 when President Johnson and Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin met in Glassboro, New Jersey. This convention, known as the Glassboro Summit, intended to reduce the number of anti-ballistic missiles, or missiles designed to intercept enemy warheads, possessed by each country. The ambitious goals were not met, but the meeting sponsored future diplomatic activity and laid the foundation for weapons reductions in later years. On November 17, 1969, President Nixon excitedly wrote to an American ambassador, "You are embarking upon one of the most momentous negotiations ever entrusted to an American delegation." Nixon was referring to the commencement of SALT I, a formalized segment of the talks initiated at the Glassboro Summit, and he did not overstate the magnitude of the moment. The negotiations, which began in Helsinki, Finland, culminated in the signing of both the interim SALT agreement and the ABM Treaty on May 26, 1972, in Moscow. The interim agreement limited the quantity of ICBMs and SLBMs to those already in operation at the time of the signing, thereby checking the threat of these devastating nuclear weapons. The ABM Treaty reduced the number of anti-ballistic missiles to 200 and the number of ABM deployment sites to 2 for each country, discouraging each power from bombing the other, as the weaker defenses provisioned by the treaty made it impossible for one nation to attack and then retreat behind their own defenses effectively. As a result, the ABM Treaty increased the accountability of each side, making a long stride towards stability and reflecting the spirit of compromise, as both sides sacrificed a valuable portion of their national defense in order to promote international security. Not only did the far-sighted provisions of this treaty quell the clamor of the nuclear arms race, they also established a precedent of benevolent relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, easing the tensions of the Cold War. President Nixon's visit to the Soviet Union during the Moscow summit represented the first time an American president set foot in Moscow, indicating that each side must leave their comfort zone in order for any real progress to be made. In fact, Harry Haldeman, Nixon's personal secretary, testified to the smooth proceedings of the signing in his diaries documenting the SALT, claiming that everybody was getting a great feeling of the historic nature of the occasion. The signing of the SALT I treaties truly was historic, as Nixon and Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, the signers of the SALT I treaties, overcame their differences in order to compromise for the greater good. Still, the SALT I treaties were not without flaws. The interim agreement was set to expire in 1977, and neither treaty prescribed a cap on the total number of nuclear warheads or addressed the accumulation of MIRVs. However, both Nixon and Brezhnev agreed to continue negotiations, ensuring that further strides would be made. In 1973, Brezhnev met with Nixon at the White House, commencing a round of negotiations known as SALT II. These negotiations intended to continue the progressive spirit of SALT I, and in 1974, Brezhnev and newly elected President Gerald Ford arrived at a consensus at the Vladivostok summit in the Soviet Union. The provisions of this conference limited the total number of strategic missiles, including ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers, to 2,400, and the quantity of missiles equipped with MIRVs to 1,320. Newly invented types of strategic missiles were prohibited altogether, but Ford and Brezhnev did not concur on the total number of nuclear warheads that each side should have. Thus, negotiations continued until June 18, 1979, when Brezhnev and President Carter signed the SALT II Treaty in Vienna. This treaty limited the total number of nuclear warheads to 2,250, of which no more than 1,320 could be ICBMs. Of these 1,320 ICBMs, no more than 820 could be equipped with MIRVs. As a result, strict limits on the nuclear arsenals were prescribed, provisioning a collective decrease of about 50,000 nuclear warheads and relieving the worst hazards of the nuclear arms race. However, the treaty was never formally ratified by Congress, and when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979, Carter requested that the treaty be withdrawn altogether. Still, both parties agreed to respect the compromise until the treaty expired in 1985, imprinting the spirit of compromise on the tense political atmosphere. In fact, Alexander Druzhinin, a political scientist for a Soviet press agency, asserted that a spontaneous and unrestrained escalation of the arms race and the risk of growing confrontation are the sole alternatives to SALT II, and that the negotiations exerted a positive influence on the development of relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. As a result, SALT II was instrumental in slowing the nuclear arms race, eliciting unprecedented benevolence between the United States and the Soviet Union, constituting a tremendous compromise. Even after SALT II, nuclear weaponry posed a grave threat to people around the world. However, both SALT I and II slowed the breakneck pace of nuclear proliferation and prompted world leaders to continue to seek permanent solutions to the crisis. Since the strategic arms limitation talks compelled the United States and the Soviet Union to overcome their ideological differences and sacrifice large portions of their nuclear arsenals for the common good, they are evidently some of the most important compromises in history.